Miami is a long way from the front lines in Ukraine. But this week, the next big decision point in the war may be traveling from Florida straight back to the Kremlin in a briefing intended for one man, Vladimir Putin. Russian state media and Western reporting say President Putin's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, is expected to brief the Russian leader on a U.S. proposal meant to move the conflict toward a settlement. Dmitriev, who serves as Russia's special presidential envoy on foreign investment and economic cooperation, and is also linked to Russia's sovereign wealth fund, held 2 days of talks in Miami with U.S. President Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, according to the Kremlin spokesman. And while that message is being carried back to Moscow, Ukraine is sending one of its own just as clearly. No peace deal is credible without security guarantees that actually prevent a new invasion. Here is what is publicly known at this hour and what is still not. Over the weekend of December 20 and 21, U.S. officials hosted parallel discussions in Florida. One track involved Ukrainian and European representatives. Another track involved Russian representatives, including Dmitriev. The stated aim is to test whether a U.S. framework can pull the two sides toward an end to the war that is now approaching its 4-year mark. But the details of the U.S. proposal have not been disclosed publicly, and neither Washington nor Moscow has released a full text or a point-by-point readout. That silence is not an accident. It is the space where leverage lives. On the Ukrainian side, President Volodymyr Zelensky says his negotiators have come back from talks with several draft documents in hand, including drafts focused specifically on security guarantees, recovery, and a basic framework to end the war. Zelensky said he was briefed by Ukrainian negotiators, including Rustem Umerov and Andriy Onatov, and he framed the documents as designed not only to stop the current fighting, but to block what he called the risk of another Russian invasion. His comments came as Ukraine reported a heavy Russian air attack on its energy system just before Christmas, killing at least 3 people and triggering widespread outages. Moscow, for its part, is trying to cool expectations. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, quoted by the Russian outlet Izvestia, said the Miami talks should not be seen as a breakthrough. He described the diplomacy as a working process. And he signaled that Russia wants detailed information from the United States about Washington's coordination with Europeans and Ukrainians. He also said the work is expected to continue in a meticulous, expert-level format. And he linked Russia's evaluation of any ideas to what he called the spirit of Anchorage, referring to an August meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, between Trump and Putin where possible parameters, including territory and security guarantees, were discussed. That matters because it suggests the Kremlin is not presenting this as a yes or no moment. It is presenting it as a negotiation over the terms of negotiation. And that is often how long wars end. Not with a single signature, but with a sequence of smaller decisions that narrow the battlefield, shape the map, and define who will enforce the next chapter. The U.S. proposal being discussed has been described by Ukrainian officials as a multi-point plan. Zelensky has said negotiators have been working on what he called a 20-point plan put forward by U.S. envoys, and he acknowledged it was criticized in its initial form by Ukrainians and Europeans as being too slanted toward Russia. Zelensky said the basic block of documents is ready, but not everything is ideal, and he emphasized that both sides still have matters they are not prepared to accept. In his nightly address, he framed the key test as whether the United States can get a real response from Russia and real readiness to focus on something other than aggression. So what is the fight over? In plain language, it is, as always, about land, power, and guarantee. Land, because Russia holds territory it seized by force, and Ukraine has insisted it cannot legitimize that seizure. Power, because the shape of Ukraine's future military and its relationships with Western allies goes to the heart of deterrence. And guarantees, because Ukraine's core argument is that a ceasefire without enforcement is simply an intermission. Security guarantees can sound technical, but the concept is simple. If Russia attacks again, what happens next and who shows up? A guarantee is not a promise to talk. It is a promise to act. That is why every adjective in these negotiations counts. bilateral or multilateral, automatic or conditional, military, economic, or political, immediate or delayed. And there is one phrase that keeps hovering over these talks, even when it is not written down in public. Something that feels like Article 5, the NATO principle that an attack on one is treated as an attack on. The gap between that and everything else is the difference between deterrence and hope. Zelensky has been explicit on the politics of. He said this month that he does not see a need to change Ukraine's constitution, which enshrines its aim to join NATO and the European Union. And he rejected the idea that Ukraine should rewrite its own strategic goals because of pressure from Russia. He also warned against any drift toward pressuring Ukraine to trade concessions elsewhere in exchange for security guarantees, calling that kind of exchange a non-starter. Yet he has also indicated in recent days that Ukraine could consider compromises on NATO membership ambitions if Ukraine receives hard security guarantees with protections similar to NATO collective defense idea. The tension between those two positions tells you exactly how high the stakes are inside Kyiv. From Moscow's perspective, the Kremlin has repeatedly argued that NATO expansion and Ukraine's Western military alignment are central security concerns. And Russian officials have long demanded limits on Ukraine's ability to join NATO as part of any end to the war. That is why the phrase security guarantees is not a neutral term in these talks. For Ukraine, it means protection from Russia. For Russia, it can sound like a backdoor route to NATO-style protection without the NATO name. And for Washington, the challenge is how to craft a guarantee strong enough to deter Moscow, while still being politically and militarily sustainable for the guarantors. If you want to understand why these talks are so hard, listen for what each side needs to tell its own public. Ukraine needs to say it did not surrender its future. Russia needs to say it did not retreat under pressure. The United States needs to say it ended the killing without creating a new open-ended commitment. Europe needs to say it protected the continent's security without outsourcing its fate. And then there is the battlefield. Even as negotiators trade papers in Florida, missiles and drones are still shaping daily life in Ukraine. Attacks on energy infrastructure are not just a military tactic. They are a pressure campaign that hits heat, light, water, and public morale. For Ukraine, winter attacks test air defenses and emergency response. For Russia, the continued fighting is leverage, a signal that time can still be used as a weapon. For diplomats, it is the clock on the wall. Every day without a pause adds grief, damage, and political pressure. That is also why the location of the talks matters. Miami is not just scenery. It is a symbol of the way this diplomacy is being run. Fast, personal, and centered on emissaries with direct lines to the top. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are not typical foreign ministry negotiators. Kirill Dmitriev is not a typical career diplomat either. He is an economic envoy and a deal-maker figure, someone whose portfolio suggests that any settlement could involve more than trenches and checkpoints. It could involve sanctions, investment, reconstruction, and the terms under which Russia and the West do business again. Listen closely to what Zelensky said about the draft documents. Security guarantees were listed alongside recovery. That pairing is deliberate. It implies a sequence. No credible rebuilding without credible security. Investors do not pour money into a country if they believe the next strike is only a season away. Governments do not pledge long-term reconstruction financing if they think the map will be rewritten again. In that sense, security guarantees are not just about preventing war. They are also about unlocking peace in an economic sense, the ability to plan, to borrow, to ensure, to rebuild. But security guarantees raise a second question that is just as sensitive. Who carries the risk? If guarantees are backed by the United States, what does that mean in practice? Is it a treaty-level commitment that would need legislative approval? Is it a standing military posture? Is it air defense coverage and intelligence support? Is it a promise of rapid military aid if Ukraine is attacked? Or is it something narrower? A coalition of European states, perhaps with U.S. backing, that provides forces, training, and deterrence on the ground. Each version has a different credibility profile, and each version has a different political cost. There is also a question of geography. Guarantees tend to be clearer when borders are clear. But in this war, control lines have shifted repeatedly, and the status of territory is the most explosive question on the table. A guarantee that covers all of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders would be ideal for Kyiv, but it would be far harder for Moscow to accept. A guarantee that covers only territory currently controlled by Kyiv might be easier for Russia to swallow, but it would leave Ukraine vulnerable and could look like acceptance of forceful territorial change. Somewhere in between sits a range of creative and risky compromises. Phased arrangements, demilitarized zones, international monitoring, or conditional steps tied to withdrawals. Each sounds plausible until you ask who enforces it at 2 a.m. when the first violation happens. And enforcement is where many ceasefires fail. Ceasefires are not self-executing. They require verification, consequences, and a shared interest in restraint. Right now, the public messaging shows that shared interest is still fragile. Russia is saying the talks are a process, not a breakthrough. Ukraine is saying progress is real, but the decisive test is Russia's readiness to stop aggression. The United States is operating as the bridge, but also as the actor under pressure to deliver something that looks like an outcome. In the background, another track of U.S.-Russia engagement continues, separate from Ukraine. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said this week that Russian and U.S. diplomats held talks on removing irritants in the relationship, including disputes affecting the functioning of each other's embassies. And he said another round of such contacts is expected in early spring 2026. Moscow described the main issues as still unresolved, and the report emphasized these embassy-focused discussions are separate from the Ukraine negotiations. That separation is important and also potentially deceptive. In real diplomacy, files bleed into each other. Embassy access, sanctions, prisoner issues, visas, consular services, frozen assets, and broader security architecture can all become bargaining chips. When two powers start talking about irritants, they are also testing whether a wider reset is possible. And in any reset, Ukraine's fate becomes intertwined with U.S.-Russia relations in ways Kyiv has always feared. So what happens next? First, Dmitriev briefs Putin. That briefing is not ceremonial. It is where Moscow decides what it can accept in public, what it can accept privately, and what it wants to extract before it moves. Second, Washington looks for a response it can bring to Kyiv and to European capitals without the plan collapsing under scrutiny. Third, Ukraine pushes to lock guarantees into the core text, not as a side letter or a future conversation. And fourth, Europe decides how much of the deterrence burden it is willing and able to carry. Watch the language. If you hear more talk about experts, technical formats, and meticulous work, that suggests bargaining over the architecture. Committees, timelines, verification team. If you hear talk about leaders meeting again, that suggests a push to lock in headline commitments, even if the details are unfinished. If you hear talk about a pause, a truce, or a phased ceasefire, that suggests Washington is trying to stop the bleeding first and resolve the hardest issues later. But later is where wars often restart. There are also risks on all sides. For Ukraine, the risk is a deal that freezes the conflict without shielding the country from the next strike. For Russia, the risk is accepting constraints that limit its options or lock in Western-backed deterrence on its border. For the United States, the risk is promising more than it can sustain or delivering less than Ukraine can accept. For Europe, the risk is strategic ambiguity, a settlement that looks stable on paper but brittle in practice, with Europe left to manage the consequences. And then there is the human clause. Every negotiation that stretches out into weeks and months competes with the next barrage, the next blackout, the next displacement. That is why diplomacy often accelerates after spikes in violence, not despite them. War creates pressure, and pressure creates movement. But movement is not the same as resolution. If this U.S. proposal is to become more than an idea, the next few steps will have to answer a handful of unavoidable questions. What lines stop the shooting? Who monitors them? What happens when they're... What security arrangement deters Russia without igniting a wider war? What political commitments can leaders defend at home? And how to rebuild a country while ensuring it cannot be shattered again. For now, the clearest picture looks like this. The United States is trying to pull together a workable settlement structure. Ukraine is trying to anchor that structure in hard guarantees, and Russia is keeping the door open while insisting the process is only a process. In the coming days, as Putin receives Dmitriev's report, we will learn whether Moscow is preparing to bargain inside that framework or to reshape it on its own terms. In a war that has already rewritten lives and borders, one briefing can still change the trajectory. Not because it ends the war overnight, but because it signals whether the next phase is negotiation with enforcement or negotiation without it. And for Ukraine, that difference is everything.